When you look at ancient texts, I mean, there is just this massive tendency to universally accept that the authors were, writing about magic.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a default setting for us.
Right. We read these passages describing a leader, like King Solomon, binding literal demons in heavy iron chains, or commanding the wind, or speaking to these invisible, ethereal spirits, and we just instantly categorize it.
Yeah, we file it straight under supernatural fairy tale.
Exactly. Or, maybe a highly abstract theological allegory if we're feeling generous. We just read it with this underlying assumption that ancient people simply didn't understand how the world worked.
So they just filled in the blanks with ghosts and genies.
Right. But there's a completely different way to approach this material, and it suggests that actually we are the ones misreading the text.
Which is such a wild paradigm shift when you first hear it.
It really is. I mean, what if those quote-unquote demons in chains aren't spooky supernatural entities at all? What if that specific passage is actually this highly clinical, historical account of a marginalized, fiercely independent mountain tribe being politically subjugated?
And then utilized as a captive labor force to build state infrastructure.
Yes. Which is just, it completely blows the lid off how we view this. And that fundamental shift in perspective, that's the entire foundation of our deep dive today.
It really is. We're looking at this profound, rigorously rational deconstruction of these ancient narratives, specifically focusing on the insights of Allama Parwaz regarding Surah in the source text.
And Parwaz's core argument here is just to completely discard the supernatural lens, right?
Completely. His approach is intensely sociological and linguistic.
Yeah.
I mean, take the word jinns, for example.
Right, the classic genie in a bottle.
Yeah, exactly. In the popular imagination, which is, fueled by centuries of folklore, a jinn is a ghost or a spirit made of smokeless fire. But Parwaz points out that historically, in the actual linguistic context of that era, the term referred to very real, nomadic, rugged human tribes.
Tribes that lived in these harsh, often invisible or inaccessible mountainous regions, right?
Yes, they were essentially marginalized populations, out of sight, out of mind. And then when the text talks about shayatin, which is a word almost universally translated today as devils or demons, it actually derives from the Arabic root shaitana.
And that root has nothing to do with pitchforks and underworlds.
Not at all. That root doesn't mean supernatural evil. It fundamentally means to rebel, to oppose, to be recalcitrant, or to actively turn away from an established political or social order.
Okay, wait, so if we unpack that, we are essentially looking at a massive historical mistranslation. A purely political rebellion was later rebranded into a supernatural hunting.
That's exactly what happened, and it alters the entire premise of the historical accounts of Solomon's reign.
Because instead of a wizard king battling the forces of darkness with, magical incantations, we are looking at a historical account of a centralized state neutralizing regional warlords.
Precisely. When the text describes binding them in chains, it's not some metaphor for a magical spell. It is a literal penal system.
Wow.
It's the physical incarceration of dissidents who chose violent rebellion over integration into the state's legal framework.
It really is a shockingly modern view of how societies deal with dissidence and labor. It strips away all the magical realism and replaces it with this masterclass in statecraft and infrastructure development.
That's right, because the shayatin were just rebellious human political leaders. They were forces of social disruption, refusing to adhere to equitable laws.
So binding them in chains is just imprisoning those who disrupt public order, keeping them restrained until they could be rehabilitated.
Or, as the text outlines, utilized for the economic and infrastructural advancement of the society. The text actually talks about utilizing this captive labor for human engineers, builders, and deep-sea divers.
Deep sea divers, not water demons, but actual pearl divers and resource gatherers.
Exactly. It's grounded completely in physical reality.
Which sets the stakes for what we are analyzing for you today. By systematically stripping away centuries of this popularized mythology, what emerges isn't a book of spells.
No, it's a rigorous critique of human power dynamics.
The sociology of rebellion, the absolute necessity of empirical science, and, honestly, the foundational laws of economics. It's a blueprint for how a society either sustains itself through rational justice or just collapses under the weight of its own corruption.
And to really grasp the mechanics of how that structural collapse happens, we have to start with the socioeconomic baseline that Parwaz extracts here.
Right. He points to that fascinating legal dispute brought before King David, who was Solomon's predecessor.
Yeah, the text presents this scenario involving two men. One man owns 99 sheep. The other man owns a single, solitary sheep.
Just one.
Just one. And the man with the 99 uses his existing leverage, his societal influence, to demand and extract that single sheep belonging to his neighbor.
Now, on the surface, that just reads like a petty local agricultural dispute, like ancient small claims court.
Right, a minor squabble.
But if you look at the actual mechanics of what is happening there, it is the ultimate distilled metaphor for unregulated monopoly capitalism.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Parwes captures this with a very specific phrase. Capital attracts capital.
Yes. Because the man with the 99 sheep doesn't need the 100th sheep to feed his family. He's not starving.
The extraction isn't driven by biological necessity at all. It is driven by the physics of wealth hoarding. Once an entity amasses a disproportionate amount of capital, that capital creates its own gravitational pull.
It's like a black hole.
Exactly. The 99 inherently consume the one, not even necessarily because of, cartoonish malice, but because unchecked accumulation is just a structural force.
If you look at modern corporate structures, it's the exact same mechanism. A massive tech monopoly doesn't buy a small startup because it desperately needs the startup's revenue to keep the lights on.
Right, they aren't struggling to make payroll.
No, it buys the startup to eliminate competition and consolidate its own gravitational pull. It wants the 100th sheep to make sure nobody else has a sheep.
That is a perfect modern parallel. It really is the physics of monopoly. And Parwes points out that dealing with this kind of extreme economic consolidation requires way more than just minor procedural reforms.
You can't just tweak the tax code a tiny bit.
Right. It requires a complete structural revolution. Which brings us to a critical distinction he makes, and this is so important, between our modern secular concept of justice and the fundamental structural justice demanded by the text, which is known as el-haq.
This distinction between procedural justice and structural justice, el-haq, is vital, because if you ask a modern citizen today what justice is, they will almost always describe a procedure.
A set of steps.
Yeah. In a standard secular legal system, if two parties go to court and the judge listens to both sides, refuses any bribes, and applies the written rules exactly as they are codified in the legal statutes.
And issues a ruling based purely on the letter of the law.
Exactly. Society universally calls that justice. It's clean, it's objective, and the procedure was followed perfectly.
It is the flawless execution of a procedure. But Parwes asks this underlying devastating question. What if the law itself is fundamentally unjust?
Right. What if the legal code dictating the outcome of that court case was written, funded, and lobbied for by the guy who already owns the 99 sheep?
Which is usually how it works. If the societal framework is designed to legally and systematically extract the final sheep from the neighbor, maybe through predatory taxation or convoluted property rights or exploitative labor contracts, then a judge following that law to the letter isn't delivering justice.
They're acting as an algorithm executing biased code.
Oh, I like that phrasing.
If the base code is written to favor the monopoly, the algorithm can run with 0 errors, 0 procedural corruption, and the output will still be highly discriminatory.
Because following an unjust law perfectly is really just efficient state-sanctioned exploitation.
Exactly. And that is precisely the point Parwes makes. Therefore, al-haq, this higher standard of structural justice, is defined as a system where the laws themselves are rooted in objective truth and equitable human welfare.
The foundation of the legal code must be completely insulated from the selfish desires and the gravitational pull of the powerful. You cannot simply administer a corrupt framework fairly.
It's impossible.
Right. The foundation of the system itself must be structurally sound and intrinsically just.
Which highlights the fatal flaw in almost all human governance. It's a flaw Parwes identifies as the accountability ceiling.
The accountability ceiling, yes.
Because if you trace the hierarchy of literally any society or corporate entity, accountability always flows upward, right? But it eventually hits a hard stop.
Buck stops somewhere, usually at the top.
Yeah, like the factory worker answers to the floor manager, the manager answers to the regional director, the director answers to the CEO.
And the CEO answers to the board of directors.
And in a state structure, the citizen answers to the police to the municipal courts, the courts to the Supreme Court, and ultimately to the head of state or the legislative body.
But Parwes asks, who holds the architects of the system accountable?
Exactly. Who polices the people who write the laws that determine who gets the sheep?
That is the ultimate vulnerability of human systems.
Mm.
Because once you reach the top of that pyramid, the architects of the system invariably insulate themselves from the very laws they enforce on the populace.
They achieve this kind of sovereign immunity.
They do. Human accountability vanishes because they have basically escaped the jurisdiction of consequence. They write the rules, so the rules don't apply to them.
But the source text counters this by presenting a completely alternative framework to reality. It introduces the concept of a closed-loop universe.
This is where it gets really fascinating.
It really does. Parwez emphasizes a specific Arabic term used in the text.
Matil.
Batil. Batil means something created without purpose, something random or something operating in vain. And the text categorically denies that the universe is batil.
Instead, it asserts the universe is created bilhaq, meaning with absolute objective truth, purpose, and an inescapable structural design.
So we aren't just talking about, like, a nice moral philosophy here. We are talking about socioeconomic thermodynamics.
Socioeconomic thermodynamics, I love that.
The universe is an action-consequence machine. Every single input inherently generates a corresponding output. Parwez refers to this as the law of mukafati amal.
The natural universal law of consequence.
Right. In a bilhaq universe, human actions, economic policies, even hidden legislative intentions, they aren't just isolated transient events that disappear into the ether.
No, they're physical forces. They generate unavoidable socioeconomic ripples. The universe actively ensures that every action eventually bears its logical fruit.
It is an ironclad law of cause and effect applied to human sociology. If an architect of a system drafts a policy designed to secretly extract wealth from the marginalized to feed the monopoly, that action is registered in the structural fabric of the society.
The consequence is initiated the exact moment the action occurs.
But let me challenge the underlying logic here, because this concept of mukafat iamal, this inevitable universal consequence, it sounds very comforting, but it kind of contradicts observable reality, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if this closed-loop system is real, doesn't it just breed apathy? I mean, if the universe is this machine that will inevitably crush a corrupt monopoly or an exploitative regime through its own natural laws, why should the marginalized take any action?
Fatalism argument.
Yeah. Doesn't this guarantee of universal consequence just become another pacifying excuse for the oppressed to wait around for the system to collapse on its own? It sounds like a theological version of waiting for the invisible hand of the market to fix a recession.
That is a very crucial challenge, and it cuts straight to the heart of how Parwez differentiates this framework from passive fatalism. The law of mukafat iyal does not negate human agency.
It doesn't.
Not at all. In fact, it relies on human agency as the primary mechanism of consequence. The text isn't suggesting the universe will intervene with, magical lightning bolts to strike down corrupt CEOs.
Okay, so how does the consequence actually manifest?
The consequence is structural, and humans are the antibodies of the social organism. When an exploitative system hoards the 99 sheep, it inherently creates conditions of deprivation.
Obviously, the guy with one sheep is now starving.
Exactly. And that deprivation breeds unrest, which then necessitates the suppression of intellect to keep people in line, and that fundamentally weakens the infrastructure of the entire society.
So the system rots from the inside.
Right. The inevitable collapse is mathematically guaranteed because the system is destroying its own foundation. But the agents of that collapse, the forces that finally tear down the rotting structure, are human beings reacting to the injustice.
Okay, so the timeline of consequence is really the key variable here.
Yes.
Escaping a local human jurisdiction, like a corrupt politician evading a court subpoena, that doesn't mean they've actually bypassed mukafat iamal.
Exactly. Because human timelines are very short. We measure things in election cycles or fiscal quarters.
But structural timelines are long. They're measured in generations.
Yet, a society that normalizes corruption and the deprivation of the masses to feed a few at the top is essentially building a skyscraper on a swamp.
The structural collapse is inevitable. It is baked into the physics of the foundation.
It might take 50 years, but the building will fall. The universe's guarantee is that an exploitative system eventually and violently consumes itself.
Which is a terrifying but validating thought. In this profound realization that an unjust system will inevitably face rational, systemic destruction, that idea is inherently dangerous to those who hold power within an exploitative system, isn't it?
Oh, it's the most dangerous idea possible. If the masses understand that the universe is governed by bilhaq, and that the foundational texts they revere actually demand structural equity and the active dismantling of monopolies.
Then the establishment's days are numbered.
Exactly. Their entire grift is exposed.
Which brings us to the most fascinating mechanism of control. How do exploitative systems prevent that realization? I mean, if the text is a rational, highly aggressive blueprint for dismantling monopolies and enforcing structural justice, how in the world did it become associated with flying carpets, magical genies, and spooky demons?
Well, Parwaz argues this wasn't just an accident of history. It wasn't just innocent misunderstanding. Historically, the establishments, meaning both the religious elite who monopolized interpretation and the political elite who monopolized resources, they deliberately weaponized superstition.
You weaponized it.
Yes, they engineered and protected these bizarre magical myths specifically to obscure the rational, dangerous core of the text.
It is a calculated, multi-generational strategy of intellectual suppression.
It really is. And Parwaz meticulously deconstructs several of these traditional tales to expose not only their logical absurdity, but their specific sociological function.
Right, like why were these specific myths propagated? Let's analyze the myth of King Solomon's horses.
Oh, the horse slaughter myth. This is a classic.
It really is. So, if you look at the traditional narrative that has been taught and codified for centuries, it claims that King Solomon was reviewing his elite cavalry. He was supposedly so distracted by admiring the beauty of these purebred horses that he lost track of the sun and missed his obligatory afternoon prayer.
Okay, so he misses one prayer.
Right. And upon realizing his mistake, the myth claims he was overcome with such pious rage and extreme guilt that he drew a sword and personally slaughtered between 10,000 and 20,000 of these highly trained, state-owned horses.
I mean, if we apply even the most basic, elementary level of critical thought to that narrative, the logistical and rational absurdity is just overwhelming.
It's comical.
We are asked to believe that a revered architect of a massive, complex, centralized state threw an emotional tantrum and systematically destroyed the primary backbone of his own nation's defense and logistical infrastructure.
Right. And let's just set aside the sheer physical endurance required for one human being to manually slaughter 20,000 large animals with a sword.
Your arm would fall off.
Exactly. The economic devastation of destroying that much state capital is staggering.
And Parwaz rightly highlights the farcical nature of the logistics here. He points out that missing one afternoon prayer might be a minor lapse in routine, but physically slaughtering 20,000 state assets would take days, if not weeks, of continuous, uninterrupted killing.
And during that entire bloodbath, he would be missing countless subsequent prayers.
That's right. The internal logic of the myth collapses instantly. It contradicts itself.
And yet, this story was vigorously defended by historical commentators for centuries.
It was treated as sacred fact. And Parwaz pairs this with another famous myth regarding Solomon's eventual successor. This one is widely known as the half-child myth.
Oh, this one perfectly illustrates the weaponization of absurdity. So the myth dictates that Solomon proudly declared he would visit his 70 wives in a single night, intending for each to conceive a legendary warrior who would fight for the state.
Okay.
However, the story claims he forgot to utter the phrase, "Inshallah, God willing." And because he omitted this specific incantation, a magical curse befell his household.
Naturally.
Naturally. None of the women conceived except for one who gave birth to a literal half-child, like a bizarre asymmetrical physical anomaly, half a body. And according to this mythological framework, this anomalous half-child is the individual who eventually inherited the throne and the kingdom.
A literal half-corpse running a kingdom.
Yeah.
We really have to ask the sociological question here.
Yeah.
What is the function of this absurdity? Why would an establishment invent a story about a half-child inheriting a kingdom or a king slaughtering his own defense infrastructure and then codify it as sacred history?
What's the payoff for them?
Parwaz's analysis of this is chilling, frankly. He argues this is a deliberate methodology designed to, in his exact words, close the doors of thought.
Close the doors of thought. Wow, that is the psychological mechanism of authoritarianism right there.
It is. By normalizing the idea that great, divine leaders are emotionally unstable, hyper-reactive despots who can destroy vital state assets on a whim and then labeling that destruction as pious, the establishment achieves something very specific.
They create a precedent.
Exactly. If a divine prophet can act with utter irrationality, then the public has no right to demand rationality from their current mortal king.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Hey, if Solomon can kill 20,000 horses because he's mad, you can't complain when the king raises your taxes?
Right. Furthermore, if royal succession is determined by magical curses regarding half-children rather than competence and merit, then the public cannot question the current monarch's incompetent son taking the throne.
It is the exact utility of the myth. It's a loyalty test to unreason.
Exactly. If you can force a populace to accept, revere, and blindly recite a narrative that violently contradicts basic physics, mathematics, and human logic, you have successfully broken their internal mechanism for demanding truth.
You've disabled their BS detector.
Completely. Because if you believe the universe is governed by magic, capricious curses, and irrational despots, you do not ask logical questions about tax policy, wealth inequality, or the accountability ceiling.
You just accept your subjugation as a mysterious divine decree.
Right. Just put your head down.
And Parwes draws a very grim conclusion about the ultimate result of this process, doesn't he? When a society abandons critical analysis of its own foundational principles, when it replaces the intellect with the rote recitation of sounds it doesn't even understand, the human being is fundamentally degraded.
He actually uses the analogy of livestock.
Yes. When humans stop thinking, they are lowered to the biological status of cattle. And cattle are incredibly easy to herd. All the establishment needs is a stick and a loud noise.
It's so true. By feeding the public supernatural fairy tales, the monopoly ensures the public never realizes they possess the actual textual mandate to demand a rational, equitable government.
They hide the blueprint in plain sight by wrapping it in magic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this suppression of the intellect through literalism, it isn't just some ancient phenomenon, it's not just history. Parwes demonstrates how this exact mindset plagues modern interpretations of law and justice today.
Right. He highlights a specific modern legal workaround to illustrate the psychology of literalism, an example we can call the broom analogy.
The broom analogy. This perfectly bridges the gap between ancient mythology and modern legalism.
It really does. So Parwes references a prominent modern scholar who is attempting to reconcile a harsh, historically literal penal code with practical physical reality. The specific law in question mandated that a criminal guilty of a certain offense must receive exactly 100 lashes.
Yeah, a very literal numerical punishment.
Right. But the scholar encountered a logistical problem. What happens if the guilty individual is elderly, frail, or medically too sick to physically survive a punishment of 100 lashes? What if 50 lashes would kill them?
Now, if the system were actually operating under Al-Haq's structural, rational justice, the people of intellect would assess the situation rationally. The goal of a justice system is rehabilitation, deterrence, and societal equity, not state-sanctioned torture or execution by proxy.
Right, a rational system would just adjust the sentencing based on the medical reality, acknowledging that the underlying intent of the law supersedes the literal mechanics of the punishment.
But that requires independent critical thought. It requires taking on the burden of intellectual responsibility.
Which the literalist mindset is terrified of doing. So instead, the scholars sought a technical loophole to bypass critical thought entirely.
What was the workaround?
The proposed legal workaround was to take a broom made of exactly 100 individual twigs. The executioner would take this broom and strike the sick individual exactly one time. Boom! One strike, 100 twigs. The scholar argued that the literal, technical letter of the law, 100 points of contact, was mathematically fulfilled, and therefore justice was served.
Parwes marvels at the complete intellectual bankruptcy of this solution, and frankly, so do I. It entirely gamifies the concept of divine or fundamental law.
It turns justice into a cheat code.
Exactly. It treats the legal code not as a profound sociological mechanism for human welfare, but as a rigid magic spell. It suggests that the universe operates on technicalities, where the exact phrasing must be matched or the precise numerical value must be physically touched, regardless of the underlying intent, the physical reality, or the outcome.
It is a profound insult to human intellect, reducing the entire philosophy of justice to a bureaucratic checklist. It fundamentally bypasses the entire purpose of having a justice system to begin, but...
Right. It's just checking a box so you don't feel bad.
So, if we sweep away the brooms of modern legalism, the mythological half-children, and the 20,000 slaughtered horses, what is the actual historical reality of this text? When Parwes removes the supernatural lens, what alternative model of society does he actually extract from the reign of Solomon?
The alternative model is a rigorous, uncompromising demand for meritocracy, organized statecraft, and the application of empirical science. Let's revisit the myth of Solomon's successor for a second.
The half-child.
Right. The text does not say he was a magical half-child. The specific Arabic word used in the text to describe the successor is Jasad.
Jasad.
Yes, jasad literally translates to a body or a corpse. In classical linguistic usage, it describes a physical form that is entirely devoid of intellect, spirit, capability, or leadership essence.
Yeah.
We would use the modern idiom of an empty suit.
So the text is actually providing a blistering critique of nepotism.
Exactly. Solomon's son wasn't cursed by a forgotten incantation. He was simply a highly incompetent ruler who inherited a position he did not earn.
It's the ancient equivalent of the modern corporate fail-son.
That's exactly what it is. You see this in media empires or massive conglomerates today, where a visionary founder builds a highly complex, functioning system and then hands the keys to a successor whose only qualification is their DNA.
And they run it into the ground.
Always. The text is stating that leadership and authority absolutely cannot be transmitted genetically.
And the sociological consequence of placing an empty suit on the throne was immediate, wasn't it?
Oh, instantaneous. When this Jasad took power, the subjugated, marginalized tribes, the jinns we discussed earlier, who had been successfully integrated and held in check by Solomon's strong, equitable, and rational administration, they immediately recognized the structural weakness at the top.
They saw the systemic decay of the central authority.
Yes, and they rebelled. The centralized system collapsed because bloodlines fail. Only merit, competence, and intellectual capability can sustain a society.
It is an active, explicit rejection of the divine right of kings. The text demands that authority be earned through capability, and if we apply this rational lens backward to Solomon's reign, the story of the slaughtered horses completely transforms too.
It goes from a tale of pious rage into a literal manual on state defense.
Precisely. The horses were never a personal vanity project, and they were certainly not destroyed. They were a highly organized, heavily invested, elite cavalry.
Parwez notes the specific Arabic terminology used in the verses here, safanat and jihad. These terms refer to exceptionally well-bred, fast, highly disciplined, and battle-ready horses.
This cavalry was the absolute backbone of state defense. It was crucial for maintaining the borders and advancing the structural system of justice, which the text refers to as zikri rab.
So Solomon wasn't distracted from his religious duties by looking at horses.
No. Inspecting and maintaining the readiness of the state's defense infrastructure was his primary duty. The text describes him affectionately assessing the animals, checking their legs and necks. This isn't the prelude to a massacre. It is the action of a highly competent commander ensuring his vital logistical resources are in prime condition.
And the so-called demons he controlled.
Well, they were the human engineers, the skilled builders, the architects, and the deep-sea divers driving a massive economic boom. They were constructing palaces, secure fortresses, and public works.
It is a historical account of incredible civic organization and technological utilization, entirely grounded in physics and economics.
Entirely. And this profound emphasis on the natural, physical world over the supernatural brings us to perhaps the most powerful and consequential deconstruction in Parwez's entire lecture.
The story of Ayub.
Yes, known in Western traditions as Job.
Right.
The traditional, universally accepted myth is that Job was a deeply righteous man who was suddenly and arbitrarily cursed by a supernatural devil.
This ethereal entity allegedly caused him to lose his wealth, his family, and afflicted him with horrific magical boils covering his entire body.
It is traditionally taught as a story of divine testing through supernatural, inexplicable torture.
But when Parwez applies his linguistic and rational methodology to the specific text, the supernatural haunting just evaporates. Job wasn't cursed by a mystical entity engaged in a cosmic wager.
What actually happened?
He was out in the wilderness, physically separated from his community, and he suffered a severe medical emergency. He was bitten by a highly venomous snake.
Wait, a snake?
Yes. Parwez points out a crucial linguistic fact. Historically, the local Arabs of that region colloquially referred to a specific species of deadly hooded cobra as a shaitan.
Wow.
It was just a common linguistic identifier for this dangerous hidden threat in the environment. So when the text states that Job was afflicted by a shaitan, it is not describing a demon from the underworld. It is providing a literal biological diagnosis of a snakebite.
That makes so much more sense. The symptoms described in the text, intense physical agony, a burning systemic fever, and the agonizing, unquenchable thirst, those are the exact physiological markers of severe envenomation.
Exactly. It is a completely grounded biological emergency happening in the physical world. He was suffering from acute neurotoxic or hemotoxic shock.
Okay, so we have a man dying of a snake bite in the wilderness. The fundamental question is, how was he cured? If the text is a manual for a rational universe, does it offer a magical solution?
Did an angel descend from the sky with a glowing vial of ethereal antidote?
Right. No. Parwes highlights that the intervention described in the text is actually a masterclass in early empirical medicine.
Job was directed to locate a natural sulfur spring in the earth, a hot spring inherently rich in mineral properties.
He was instructed to physically strike the ground, locate the water source, and bathe in it. The sulfur water would serve to disinfect the necrotic wound, cool his severely feverish body, and he was told to drink the water to hydrate and flush the toxins.
Furthermore, he was instructed to take a specific handful of medicinal herbs or twigs found in that environment and apply them directly to the affected area.
We're looking at an ancient protocol for pharmacology, wound care, and natural healing. It's pure empirical science.
And here we arrive at the most crucial, paradigm-shifting detail of the entire narrative.
Yes, this is the key.
Parwes highlights a specific, explicit ban issued to Job in the text regarding his healing process. The text contains a direct command warning against taham-perasti.
Taham-perasti, let's unpack that.
Taham-perasti is the reliance on superstition, irrational amulets, magical spells, or the belief in unseen mystical forces curing physical ailments.
That detail fundamentally changes the entire trajectory of the text, because it is not simply offering a natural cure as an option. It is actively forbidding the magical one.
Exactly. It is an ancient text telling a dying man, do not go to the witch doctor, do not tie a string around your arm, do not recite a magical chant, and do not wait for a miracle. Wash the wound, apply the herbs, and follow the empirical biological process.
Parwes argues this is a direct, uncompromising mandate for what the text calls the Ulu al-Albab.
The Ulu al-Albab, the people of intellect.
Right. The people who possess deep, critical understanding. The mandate to the Ulu al-Albab is clear. You must use empirical science, you must diagnose illnesses and societal problems objectively, and you must utilize the natural earthly mechanisms provided by the Bilhak universe to solve them.
It is a total structural validation of the scientific method over blind, superstitious faith.
It demands that human beings actually use the intellect they were given to interact with the physical laws of the universe, the mukafat amal we discussed earlier.
If you are physically sick, the universe has a biological mechanism for healing. Discover it. Use it.
And if your society is economically sick, the universe has a structural mechanism for justice. Implement it.
Do not rely on magical thinking, because the moment you rely on magic, you make yourself vulnerable to the people selling the illusions.
And the people selling the illusions are almost always the ones hoarding the 99 sheep.
Always. Which allows us to synthesize everything Parwes has extracted from this dense, frequently misunderstood passage.
When you completely strip away the magical fairy tale veneer that has obscured these words for centuries, what remains is not a collection of theological rituals designed to appease an angry, unpredictable deity.
Not at all. What remains is a staggering, highly detailed architectural blueprint for a functioning, resilient human society. It is an uncompromising demand for a civilization governed by critical intellect, profound economic equity, and rational problem-solving.
And Parwes insists that this blueprint comes with what we can call an earthly guarantee.
An earthly guarantee.
Right, because this entire discussion isn't predicated on rewards or punishments in some unseen afterlife. The text asserts that believers in this rational, equitable system and those who deny it by relying on exploitation, nepotism, and superstition will not experience the same outcomes right here on Earth.
It is a sociological law of gravity. A society that actively builds its foundation on meritocracy, empirical science, and a legal code of al-haq, a code that strictly prevents the monopoly from using the law to extract the final sheep, has a massive structural advantage.
That society will inevitably overpower, out-innovate, and outlast any competing society that is rotting from the inside out due to incompetent nepotism, blind superstition, and the unchecked hoarding of wealth.
The rotting society might possess a temporary illusion of immense power. They might control the largest global corporations, possess the most entrenched political dynasties, and project massive military force.
But structural decay is an inevitable mathematical certainty. When the highest levels of authority are occupied by an empty suit, a jasad devoid of intellect, the marginalized and subjugated populations will inevitably recognize the systemic weakness.
The infrastructure will begin to crumble because the engineers are imprisoned rather than utilized.
The economic engine will seize up because all the capital is hoarded at the top, unable to circulate.
The system will collapse violently under its own unsustainable weight, because the universal law of consequence, mukafat amal, cannot be bribed.
It cannot be lobbied.
And it absolutely cannot be bypassed with a technical loophole, like a broom made of 100 twigs. It demands reality.
It demands reality, and that demand for reality forces us to turn the lens away from ancient history and directly onto our modern systems. We must critically examine the architecture of the societies we inhabit today.
Right, because when you look at the corporate structure of the company you work for, or the political apparatus of the nation you live in, how far up the pyramid does the accountability actually go before it hits that ceiling?
How often do we, as modern citizens, accept the magic and the myths of our own sophisticated economic systems?
We might laugh at the ancients for believing a king slaughtered 20,000 horses. But do we blindly trust that the invisible hand of the market will magically sort out severe wealth inequality, even as the wealth gap mathematically explodes year after year?
Do we accept that corporate hierarchies and political dynasties operate fairly simply because the procedural laws say they do? We are often just as guilty of believing in magical genies building palaces out of thin air.
We just call those genies trickle-down economics or algorithmic efficiency.
The challenge laid down by the text is unavoidable for you. Are we operating as the Ulu al-Albab, the people of intellect, actively demanding empirical proof, structural accountability, and fundamental equity?
Or are we allowing the doors of our thought to be quietly closed, passively accepting the modern myths handed down to us by the institutions that already own the 99 sheep?
It's a profound, unsettling challenge to our daily complacency. We have to examine our own literalism, our own superstitions, and our own willingness to be treated as livestock. And I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Let's hear it.
If the ultimate historical form of rebellion, the true etymological meaning of a shaitan, is simply the recalcitrant rejection of rational, equitable laws in favor of selfish extraction and hoarding, then who are the actual shayateen walking in our modern halls of power today? And more importantly, what modern myths have they successfully sold us to ensure we never realize they are there?